Hey everybody, I want to talk a little bit about divine images and what they are. But to start, I'm going to go back to an artifact that was discovered a little over 10 years ago in southeast Turkey. This is called the Katumuwa Stili, and this is a drawing I did of this stele for a forthcoming book I have. And this features a deceased person named Katumuwa, and he has an inscription on there. He is depicted sitting on a throne before a feast, and this inscription describes who he is, and then it prescribes a number of offerings that are to be made to my soul, which is in this stele. And the idea being that upon the erection of this mortuary stele in his little mortuary chapel, which may or may not be located where he is buried, his soul would inhabit this stele, and people would be able to access it. So his living descendants would be able to access his presence, his soul, by visiting his mortuary chapel and his mortuary stele and then making offerings. And the invocation of his name and the making of offerings would be ways to ensure his continued survival. Now, I want to compare this artifact to headstones today, and I want to point out that there is an interesting feature of headstones today that parallels what was going on anciently. Have you ever seen someone, or maybe you've done it yourself, or maybe you've seen it in a movie or something like that, someone visiting a graveside speaking to the headstone as if to the deceased person? There's something just intuitive about thinking of that headstone as an index for the agency of that person. And if we get to thinking about it rationally, we realize that doesn't make a ton of sense. But it is something intuitive, and it is something that has been going on for literally thousands of years in societies all around the world. And so when we think about the Katumuwa Stili, when we think about headstones today, I want you to also think about standing stones that we find mentioned in the Bible and that we find in ancient cult sites, such as the Holy of Holies at the Judahite temple in Arad in southern Israel, which was likely decommissioned by Hezekiah and hidden so that as the Assyrian king Sennacherib came through destroying city after city, this would be protected. Now, we believe that, well, some scholars believe that the intent was to come back through and recommission the temple later, but that never happened, and we were able to uncover it with the standing stone laid down on its side. Now, the function of this standing stone is identical to the function of the Katumuwa Stili, is identical to the way some people treat headstones today. That is, it houses, it facilitates access to, it presences the deity's agency. You access the agency of the deity by visiting that standing stone in that holy place. So this is a very intuitive way to access divine agency in the presence of the deity. This is the logic of divine images. And we find it in the treatment of deceased kin. And even down to this day, we find ourselves intuitively treating material media as facilitating the presence, the agency of deceased persons. And so when we talk about idols and divine images, I would love for us to get away from the uncritical adoption of the anti-idol polemic of the Bible and to think a little more critically about how people anciently reasoned the function of divine images, because it builds on intuitive aspects of human cognition, things that come naturally to us. And I'm going to do some videos about where deity comes from and what kinds of divine images we find mentioned in the Bible a little later. But I wanted to start by pointing out these connections that headstones, standing stones, these mortuary stele like those of Katumuwa and others that we know of, these are all different manifestations of the same feature of human cognition. And so we should not easily, hastily, polemically dismiss this logic, because it is something that we still do today. And when we approach things like the Bible as a means of manifesting divine presence, divine agency, as a means of accessing divine information, we're doing the same thing with the Bible that people did with divine images anciently. And this is not to say this is a bad thing. I think this is somewhat inevitable. But when we look at the anti-idol polemic of the Hebrew Bible, it's interesting to see that you have the traditional divine images of the pre-exilic period, standing stones, having the text of the law overlaid upon them. Joshua, Moses, they're commanded to write the law on standing stones, and then sacrifices are offered and worship takes place before these standing stones. And in a way, it's almost a passing of the baton from the old traditional media, cultic media, to the new cultic media, which would be the text of the law. And this passing of the baton may have taken place in the exile, in the absence of the temple. How are we going to facilitate access to the divine presence? Well, let's use the law. And so the Ark of the Covenant functions as a divine image, or houses divine images in the way that it's described in the Hebrew Bible. It is basically a model shrine. And what went in it? Well, the tablets of the law. Tablets of the law are basically miniature standing stones with the law written on them, which parallels what happened anciently. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about these connections a little later on, but hopefully that gives you something to think about.